and thank you for joining us tonight. We're really excited about tonight's science update. Before we get started, just a few things to mention. You're all muted, so if you have questions, make sure to type them into the questions box that's on the right-hand side of your screen. At the end of the presentation, we'll have some time to answer any questions that come in. If we're running out of time, we'll get back to you by email, so don't hesitate and keep those questions coming. If anyone wants to learn more, contact us to schedule a meeting with you and your team. With that out of the way, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kim Cooch, CEO and founder of Carie-Free. Dr. Cooch has been successfully practicing dentistry for 35 years. He practices 3 days a week here in Albany, Oregon. He is also the world's leading authority on ATP as it relates to caries risk assessment. I know there's a lot of info to get through tonight, so Dr. Cooch, you have the floor.
All right, hey, thank you, Lacey. And I'm kind of getting this stereo feedback here, but uh-oh. Are we having a little technical difficulty here? Here. Oh, now we're better. Is that okay? I'm getting like some static and a little bit of feedback, but am I coming across okay? I'm not sure what my headset is doing here. One moment, gang. Yeah, it sounds okay when you listen to me? Okay, then I'll just go. I'm good. Okay, cool. Well, welcome everybody tonight. This is always my favorite webinar of the year, and it's also our best attended webinar of the year. So we've got hundreds of people with us tonight, and I really appreciate the fact that you share my passion for dental caries. So I had a little trouble weeding through all of the research. Typically, I update, the last 12 or 14 months when I do this, but I tried to, there were so many studies that I thought were pertinent that I wanted to share with you. I really tried to weed it down to just studies that were published in 2015. Some of these, if you've been following webinars, a few of these you've seen before. Some of them, a lot of them will be brand new to you. And then at the end, I want to close with a kind of a new concept, some observations that we've been making too. So let's get started here. We still know, I mean, this was just published in May in the Journal of Dental Research. Dental caries is still the #1 disease in the world. I don't anticipate that changing anytime soon. Untreated dental caries in primary teeth is the #10th most prevalent health condition in the world as well. So not only are we talking about dental caries, untreated dental caries in adults, but it's the 10th largest condition affecting people worldwide. And I'm still getting a lot of feedback here. Hang on. I'm not sure what my headset is doing here. I don't know what it's doing. So, can you hear me now fine? Okay. So let's go ahead. I'll just use the regular handset here on the telephone. So it's still the #1 condition, and I expect that to remain for a long time. The total economic impact of dental caries worldwide is estimated at $442 billion, and this is the most recent data we have, and that's from 2010. Interestingly enough, I think that figure is highly underestimated in terms of, what the real impact is. But the challenge we've got here is, here's the #1 and #10 conditions, affecting us from a health standpoint globally, and it only gets 4.6% of our resources. That's because I guess it's not a life-threatening disease. Typically we don't look at it that way, so it doesn't get the attention. But it's, the number one disease in the world gets 4% of our resources. So I think that's an issue that we all deal with. So kind of with that as the background. So what's new and what's the update for the science? And so we'll just kind of go through this in a fashion. We'll start with looking at the bacteria and things that we've identified with cariogenic organisms. And one of the things that we've known for a long time is that Candida albicans is highly acidic and appears to play a role in the decay process, particularly in dentin lesions. when it's deep in the tooth. But one of the interesting things that I thought this year, this paper came out just this last month in the Journal of Dental Research, was that Candida albicans does play a role, and that we know how now, that it's basically, it binds really well to glucosyltransferase B, which is like, that's the enzyme that these organisms are using to metabolize, sugars with. So it binds 2.5 times higher and 20 times higher in terms of stability than glucosyltransferase with strep mutans. So now we kind of got the pathway and the mechanism by which we know that this organism participates in the decay process as well. This I thought was a very interesting paper, and I wanted to share it with you. This just came out this last month in the Journal of Dental Research as well. And the observation they made is that, lactobacillus doesn't really become a permanent kind of member of a biofilm, that it only exists in the human body in just very specific niches, and it appears to stay primarily planktonic. And so the question becomes, well, is lactobacillus really a truly indigenous, member of the human, microbiome, or is it just a kind of a transient organism that we picked up? And they go back to an evolutionary standpoint and hypothesize that we picked this up from fermented fruit, and that actually the lactobacillus that is in the intestine actually come from bacterial or caries lesions in the mouth. So it really only exists in caries lesions in the mouth and in the intestines, and appears to be secondary there. So the question, I think it's an interesting question to ask, is it really even truly a permanent member of the human microbiome? Anyway, I thought it was an interesting theory, and just something we need to know more about lactobacillus, because certainly it's a very strongly acid uric bacteria, and we know plays a role in dental caries. And then this was a review. This paper was published at the end of the year last year in 2014, and I included in this review tonight because I think that it really kind of summarizes where dental caries research has really grown a lot in the last year, and that's in the field of genetics. And so this was a review of all of the genetics and the genes that we've identified to date that appear to play a role in the dental caries process. And I talk to researchers, and I see information that maybe as much as 50% of the dental caries that we see can be explained by genetics alone. So it's a major player. I mean, this research is all developed really in the last 5 years, and suddenly, I think we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg, and there's really a strong genetic component for this disease. Now, in the paper, they go through the different genes that we've identified, and there's a broad variety. I mean, we can do genome-wide association studies now and look at 500,000 or 600,000 different gene sites in the human DNA, and then look at and compare that to DMFT scores and look, is there any kind of correlation? Does there appear to be a correlation? And some of them are quite obvious, like genes that affect enamel formation. Okay, so if we had a defective enamel formation, or a polymorphism of that gene, you might think, okay, that makes sense. I see that. Immune response genes. I've brought up beta defensin 1 a number of times in the past, which is a bacteriolytic enzyme. It's a protective enzyme found in the saliva. So, you look at those immune response genes, and I go, yeah, that makes sense to me. Some of them are even human leukocyte antigens, that come from, white blood cells. So it's not just those enzymes, but, the white blood cells as well. And then, salivary genes. And, again, that makes sense. And then there's other genes, particularly some that the TAS2R38 gene, which affects taste, particularly makes those children super tasters. They're very sensitive to phenols and some of the green vegetables. MMPs, matrix metalloproteinases, like number 13 has been demonstrated, and of course that is involved in the breakdown of the proteins in dentin. So at present, at the time that this study was published toward the end of last year, there were 27 genes at that time that we've identified that have strong association studies. You can probably add about 7 more to that list already, from 2015. So we're really looking at, and again, I think this is just maybe the tip of the iceberg here as we do more research. So these are papers that were just from this year. This is one that looked at, well, is there a difference in terms of the effect or the impact of these genes depending upon whether you're male or female? Is there a difference does your gender matter in terms of how these genes express themselves? And so this was a study that involved 2,663 individuals out of 740 families. They were from age 1 to 93. And again, they looked at these different genes. And what they found was that it appears that the genes related to or increasing your risk for dental caries seem to have a greater impact on boys in primary teeth. And then when it gets to permanent teeth, different genes play important roles for each of the different sexes. So there is kind of a difference based on your gender on how these genes might express themselves, both in primary teeth and then also differently in permanent teeth. So I thought that was kind of an interesting concept, something I hadn't really considered before. And then this was lactotransferrin gene, and lactotransferrin again provides protection against dental caries. It's another enzyme found in the saliva, and in this in the study here, they looked at 677 12-year-olds. 331 were caries-free. 346 of those kids have a DMFT score greater than 1. And when they looked at that and looked at their polymorphism for this allele, what they found was that the lactotransferrin gene, allele A, actually provided protective effect against dental caries, and actually significantly associated with caries protection even in the presence of gingivitis and plaque. So, again, here's another enzyme that we've identified. You find this in the saliva, which makes a lot of sense. And then we get back to the taste and sweet preference genes. The TAS1R2, 1R3 genes are both associated with sweet preference in terms of taste. And so in this study, they looked at 184 7 to 12-year-olds, and they compared their preferences with their sweet or diet preferences with their DMFT scores. And the TAS1R3 gene was associated with moderate caries risk, and the TAS1R2 gene was associated with, pretty much with high caries risk. But they were both associated with increased dental caries risk. So knowing that, your child favors sweet things based on the genes, the taste genes that they have, the outcome is basically it has an impact on, their dental caries experience. And then this was another study, again, with the TAS1R2 gene and then the GLUT2 gene as well. And same conclusion, they looked at 647 18 to 65-year-olds, looked at their DMFT scores, looked at their diet and their preferences, and found that, the role of sweet liking is a predictor for dental caries risk. And, obviously sugar plays a huge role in dental caries. That's not anything new, but now that we know there are some genetic predispositions behind people, having a preference for, say, picking a donut versus eating an apple, or eating another piece of fruit or something like that. Yet another study, they looked at 637 11 to 13-year-olds. 155 of those were caries-free. 482 had a DMFT score greater than 1, and they found that the GLUT2 individuals had significantly more frequent dental caries, and the same was true for also the TAS1R2 gene. However, there was no significant association. They were independently associated with an increased risk for dental caries, but there was no combined effect between those two genes, at least in this study. So again, you're looking at, two more genes we're identifying here. This I thought was a very interesting paper. It's a cohort study. There were 1,731 individuals in this, and it's bone morphogenic proteins. And so the BMP2 gene was associated with caries experience in the primary dentition, and it affected the primary enamel microhardness. So we know that this gene may also play a role in the dental caries risk in the primary dentition. So there's actually been quite a number of more studies that I didn't include. I weeded out. I thought these were the most interesting. And then this was a review. This was published in August. And basically just kind of reviewed, where we're at. Associations were found between ameloblastin, amelogen, enamellin, tufulin, interactive protein, and now MMP20 in addition to MMP13, and enamel from permanent teeth, but not necessarily with primary teeth. And so they continue, we know that we have these associations, and there appear to be a different set of genes that affect the primary teeth, or let's say the genes have a different impact on the primary teeth than they do on the permanent teeth, and there may be a whole different set of genes that cause interactions like that between distinctly between the primary and permanent dentitions. But it's a pretty good summary of where we're at. And, genetic risk, I think, is something that, I've underestimated up until the last few years, but certainly I believe now that it plays a major role. And if you look at it, so, what's the impact of that? I have to tell you that I took this idea from Tyrone Lodog, who is a nutrition physician, teaches alternative medicine, and she's an amazing individual I had the opportunity to spend time with this year. But in a sense, genetics loads your gun, but it's the environment that pulls the trigger. So you may have a GLU2 and it has 1 or 2 gene that predisposes you to liking sweetness and maybe having a higher risk for dental caries. But if you're raised in a home where there's very limited exposure, very restricted diets in terms of sugar, you're not going to see the kind of expression from those 2 genes that you might see in another household where the environment there may be a lot, let's say, more liberal in terms of sugar exposure. So it's really, you've got the gene, load your gun, but it's really the environment then that pulls the trigger. So I think that we need to kind of keep that in mind. Now, even in the best case scenario, some of those genes are going to still increase your risk and still going to maybe have some kind of expression. But, the best that we can do to mitigate and control those, in terms of diet or, some of those issues, that's the best that we can do. I can't change your DNA. I can't change the patient's DNA, but I can certainly educate them in terms of genetic risk. And, and they're good, healthy dietary recommendations that I would make to all patients anyway, particularly when it comes to those genes. And this is a paper that was published in May of this year in Inside Dentistry, and I thought that it was very interesting just as kind of a review about biofilms and dental caries. And again, we get back to, this is a new term that you're going to hear over and over again, a dysbiosis or a dysbiotic biofilm. And that means it's a dysfunctioning biofilm. It's doing something wrong or something that's not functioning for your health. So this is a term you probably want to file away, dysbiosis or dysbiotic. That's kind of a new term in the field, and you're going to continually hear that as we go forward. So I wanted to introduce that term to you. And again, they talk about, some of the risk factors: xerostomia, diet, social habits, inadequate hygiene, chronic diseases, and basically all of the known risk factors, and kind of how I've lumped them together as the usual suspects. So, but I just want to introduce the term dysbiotic or dysbiosis to you tonight. This was a paper published in the Texas Dental Journal in January 2015, and it's really kind of a sad statement of where the profession is at. In spite of all the progress we've made in Canberra in the last 15 years, the vast majority of dentists do not use any kind of a risk assessment form. And not only do they not use a form, they don't tie the findings of a form to any individualized preventive program for a patient. So it's like, yeah, I know that you have this risk and that we've identified that. Still, that doesn't, I'm not then taking that information and then helping you develop a strategic plan for yourself on how to treat that. So, I mean, the primary thing is you have cavities and you need to brush and floss better. And here's some fluoride. I mean, you are back to that's what we've been doing for forever, and it's gotten us to the point where dental caries is #1 disease in the world. So it's a little frustrating. We've made great progress in the dental schools. Caries management, Canberra is being taught as part of the curriculum. It's a required part of the accredited curriculum at this point in time, but we still haven't really implemented this into practice yet. So I thought this survey of 540,000 or 547 general practitioners, I thought was kind of telling on where we're at. And this is one of Featherstone's papers, and this was published in this last year about just a year ago, 2014 in October. And I included this paper because I think it's really important for us to understand. In Featherstone's work, they went back and looked at and did secondary analysis on the data to find out they were giving them chlorhexidine, they were giving them fluoride rinses, they were giving them camber instructions, and they were using a fluoridated toothpaste, and they had a 24% reduction in DMFT scores over a period of 2 years. And they went back and thought, let's do secondary analysis of the data and try and figure out which one of these things caused the outcome. Like we reduced the decay rate by 24%, what caused it? Was it the fluoride rinse? Was it the chlorhexidine rinse? Was it the fluoride toothpaste? What was it? And when they individualized and looked at each of those factors, the sum was greater than the parts. And so the actual outcome was greater than each of the individual parts would have indicated that it should have been. And so they termed this the Canberra effect. And I think it's interesting that just by going through the Canberra process, it actually increased the outcome. Just the process itself improved the outcome beyond what we would have expected based on, the individual pieces. So, 1 + 1 + 1 = 6 instead of 4. So John and his team termed that the Canberra effect. Another outcome from that study was that the baseline was very predictive. So their caries risk and baseline, when they went through that, was very predictive of their future caries experience. So we know that the Canberra form, the caries risk assessment, is a very good predictor for future caries risk. Yet one more paper from Featherstone in this last year, and it was published just this last month in the BMC Oral Health. They looked at 2,724 adults. They followed them for 18 months, and so these were high-risk caries adults. They broke them into 2 groups. In the treatment group, they were giving them basically products once a month and instruction and reinforcement and education, around their home care and their caries experience once a month. And the control group just got a one-time exposure to that at the beginning of the trial. And what they found was 18 months later, the group reduced their DMFT scores by about 33%, by about a third. So for every 3 patients that were given the monthly reinforcement, for every 3 patients, reduced 1 DMFT between them. And so I think this gets back to a little bit of what we know about human behavior. I can't tell you once that you need to floss, or I tell you once that you need to use this rinse, and expect that that's going to affect the behavior change in you. What I really need to do for the patient is to constantly reinforce that. I've looked at some of the weight loss programs, and some of the ones that are most successful have a daily email contact and reminder. It gets automatically generated, but it's like over the course of the time that people in the weight loss program, they get reminded, they get contacted every day, so that it continually reinforces, their goal, what they're doing, reminds them this is a new behavior we're trying to create, a new habit. And I think that, we eventually need to get to that same place in dentistry. So thought this was a very interesting outcome. Now, fluoride's been kind of a hot topic this last year as well. And one of the first questions is fluoridated water, is it still relevant? In a world where we have high exposure to fluoride everywhere that we turn, does fluoridation in the water provide any additional outcome? And I think that's a really legitimate question. And so I'm going to provide 2 studies. There were 3 studies actually done, but these 2 were from this year. And this was done in Australia. It was in rural Australia where the water previously had not been fluoridated. And this is post, the modern world of, widespread fluoride use, when it's in our rinses and it's in our toothpaste, and you're getting fluoride treatments at the dental practice and what have you. And what they found was that by fluoridating the water, it decreased within 3 years' time in these children. They were basically followed 4 to 9-year-old children over a span of 3 years. 201 of them were pre-fluoride, 256 of them were post-fluoride, and the comparison of their DMFT scores was 87 versus 75, and a 19% reduction in these caries experience in these communities, with the highest caries rates in Australia. So the fluoridated water actually improved the outcome in children, and we have a lot of data that always supports the outcome of improved outcomes of fluoride with children. Then looking at young young adults in this study, age 15 to 46. They looked at DMFT scores, and again, those that had a lifetime exposure to fluoride with fluoridated water versus not having it, just the widespread use of fluoride alone, we did change the DMFT scores from 6 to 9 and from 4 to 7. So we saw that in terms of fillings. So that we saw that fluoridated water is still relevant in young adults as well. And of course, then the Cochrane report came out, and this was in June, and this created, of course, a lot of furor as well. And the challenge that we have with fluoridated, looking at studies for fluoridated water, particularly the Cochrane study here, most of these studies were prior to 1975, and there's very little, there's not really a lot of good evidence or a lot of studies on fluoridated water currently. However, the studies, the conclusion was studies of the prior to 1975, concluded that water fluoridation is effective at reducing caries levels in both deciduous and permanent dentition in children. Again, most of our fluoride studies involve positive outcomes in children, and then it kind of breaks down as we look as the cohort ages. When we get into adults, we tend to see less and less impact. So the question is it still relevant? I believe that it is, and certainly we have good evidence that it works on children and young adults. And then there was a study, it was published a little over a year ago, on older adults in Australia, and it had the same kind of outcome. So I think water fluoridation is still a relevant topic for us. One of the greatest challenges we have, of course, is that not many people drink tap water today. Almost everybody's drinking bottled water, and you can get bottled water or even distilled water that has fluoride added to it, but most of the bottled waters are fluoride free. Then this was a study then that looked at DMFT scores with fluoride varnish. They looked at 476 3 to 6-year-olds. They examined them at 0, 3, and 6 months, compared the DMFT scores, and basically this just reaffirms what we know about fluoride varnish. It works. You have to use it at least 4 times a year on those high-risk patients to see an outcome. Previous studies indicate that 2 times a year, doesn't provide any net additional outcome. It needs to be more like 4 times. So fluoride varnish is definitely kind of an always for us. And then this was a survey, again, of 189 general practitioners, and it was a little alarming to me. 54% of dentists, only 54% of dentists recommend an in-office fluoride treatment to more than 50% of their patients, in the 6 to 18-year-old age bracket, and only 15% recommend this care to more than 50% of their patients over the age of 18 years. And, probably half of your patients are high caries risk in your practice. That's based on a lot of data that we've got in some of the trials that we've conducted. And, a fluoride varnish treatment we still know is probably one of the best and easiest things that we can do for patients to try and help them, reduce their caries risk, and it doesn't require compliance because we can, we apply it in the office. And so I think we're, as a profession, kind of missing the boat by not, utilizing in-office fluoride treatments more than we have. Anyway, I was kind of surprised by that data, because that's kind of an always in our practice, even for adults. If you're high risk for dental caries, you're getting a fluoride varnish anyway. And so that's something that kind of surprised me. This was a paper then that looked at sealants on primary teeth, and then compared them, sealants to fluoride varnish on a primary molar. And they did 267 matched pairs, and what they found was that the sealants worked. However, their definition of success was 43% of the sealants were still retained at a year. That's not really a high success rate, but we are talking about primary teeth. But it was significantly better to seal the teeth than to just put fluoride varnish on them in terms of occlusal fissures and lesions on the occlusal fissure. So varnish versus sealants, varnish is great for all the smooth surfaces. Sealants would be a better treatment for certainly even on primary molars. Now this was a simulation model on 12-year-olds, and looking at that occlusal fissure and how do we treat it and how do we diagnose it, and it's that questionable occlusal lesion, and you and I have to make these decisions, and you make them 100 times every day. Is this a tooth that I don't need to do anything to? Is it a tooth that I should put some fluoride varnish in this mouth? Is this a tooth that I should put a sealant on? Is this a tooth that I should do a preventive, primary restoration in? This is a tooth that needs an occlusal restoration, and you and I have to make that decision, like over and over and over. And I know that the patient's caries risk and their age and your experience with that individual patient influences your decision making, and it should. And I know that you think about that when you're making those decisions. But this is a simulation model on well, what's the cost of the different ways that we approach treating these lesions? And combining radiographic and fluorescence, like using a diagnodent type diagnostic tool, led to overtreatment, particularly in patients that were low caries risk. And that, I think that makes sense to me. For the low caries risk patient, looking at the teeth under magnification, I'd recommend that over using an Explorer. I think Explorers provide very little data for us at this point in time. Or radiographic detection with microinvasive treatment, which would be a sealant, retain the teeth the longest at the lowest cost. In the populations with high caries risk or high prevalence, combining radiographic detection with microinvasive treatment was the most cost-effective. So, the bottom line here is, the most cost-effective thing that we can do for patients, and whether they're high risk or low risk, is good radiographs, good visualization of those fissures, look at their caries risk, and then make a decision whether to seal that tooth or not. And that's the best cost-effective outcome. And then looking at sealants per se, this is a study that looked at 64 7 to 10-year-olds, and they had at least 2 IC-DOS lesions that were from 0 to 2, and some of them were as high as 4, which is a non-cavitated lesion, but you've got caries developing below the surface of the fissure. And so regardless of the severity of the lesion, sealants were 100% effective at 12 months and 98% effective over 44 months. And so the conclusion here was it was even effective on lesions without, that were as high as IC-DOS 4. And using a clear sealant so you can see through it was the recommendation from this study, so that you could touch it up and monitor and make sure that if you needed to do any repair, if there was any progression of the lesion, that you could see that. I mean, I think we've all had the experiences of the sealant bombs, over the last 25 years. And there was a time 15 years ago, I questioned whether we should even be doing sealants. But, at this point in time, looking at the, the weight of the evidence in terms of the scientific studies, I still recommend and believe that we should do sealants and do them routinely. We're probably not utilizing this procedure as much as we should be. Now, having just said that, I want to share this study with you that just came out last month in September in the Journal of Dental Research. And I included this because I thought this is very interesting. They compared on children on high occlusal risk surfaces of first permanent molars in children. And they compared standard toothbrushing, a composite resin sealant, and then the atraumatic restorative glass ionomer at the school, on the school premises, in preventing cavitated dentin caries lesions in these high caries risk kids. What they found was that if you really had a high caries risk fissure on one of these children, the standard toothbrushing, the resin sealant, and the GIC all failed at about the same rate. I mean, neither one, none of them really worked well at preventing that lesion from developing. And if you had a low caries risk occlusal fissure, that it didn't really matter whether they did standard toothbrushing or did nothing, didn't even brush their teeth. They had the same basic outcome. So the interesting thing was, if it's a high caries fissure, it doesn't really matter what how you approach treating it. It's probably going to develop or progress on its own anyway. And if you got a low caries risk fissure, the kid doesn't even need to brush their teeth. It's not going to progress. It's not going to turn into a lesion. So, it's kind of interesting. The teeth that need sealants need them. The teeth that don't need sealants, the sealant's not going to do anything for those kids. They don't need a sealant on that tooth. They don't need to brush that tooth. It's not going to develop a lesion. So I thought, not that I'm going to tell patients you don't need to brush your teeth, but I just thought it was very interesting that standard toothbrushing on these fissures was no improvement even over just doing nothing. So education, sealants, fluoride, best approach to treating these high-risk kids. I included this study because, it was a systematic review, and it came in the Journal of Dentistry in January this year, asking the question, and we all have this question, we're excavating a deep lesion, where do I stop? Do I stop in the infected dentin? Do I stop in the affected dentin? Where's that point, and, how do I make that decision? And basically, the bottom line of our scientific evidence is you're better off stopping and leaving even some soft caries dentin and using maybe a glass ionomer or something over it before you go ahead and restore that tooth than going ahead and trying to remove all of it. There's more incidents or more outcomes with root canals and problems down the road by doing complete removal than by doing incomplete removal. So if you feel a little nervous about that, the scientific evidence supports you in terms of, when in doubt, if you're worried about you're getting close to the pulp or a pulp horn, stop. I use Unisem, put some Unisem or glass ionomer over that exposed area of soft dentin, and then go ahead and do your restoration. That's the best approach based on our scientific evidence. So chlorhexidine has been certainly a couple of studies, and from the Cochrane reports this last year on chlorhexidine, I questioned whether or not it should be used in terms of treating dental caries. And again, in this, found that there was really no studies to support or refute the assertion that chlorhexidine is more effective than a placebo in terms of preventing or reducing the reduction of mutant streptococci levels in children, both children and adolescents. And again, that's a systematic review by Cochrane. Then they also did another one, and we talked about this when I did the xylitol webinar earlier this year. And, the Cochrane report came out and said, we found some low-quality evidence that xylitol along in a fluoridated toothpaste does provide some additional benefit for children in terms of permanent teeth in children, and there's no associated, downside to that. However, there's a high risk of bias in terms of the studies because there was only 2 studies, and they were both done on the same population by the same researchers. So, we're really talking about low quality of evidence, but again, I'm still, firmly in the xylitol camp at this point. But again, in terms of this systematic review of scientific evidence we have, Cochrane came out and just said we don't have any evidence to say beyond weak evidence that it helps in permanent teeth in children. This was a study then that was published in the Caries Research Journal in January. They took 5- and 6-year-olds in the schools. They gave them gummy bears that contained xylitol. They were in 2nd grade. They examined them again and found that there really wasn't any improvement in terms of DMFS scores by the addition of the xylitol gummy bears. And of course, most of the children in the study were all using fluoridated toothpaste and going through standard home care, and there didn't seem to be an additional benefit from the xylitol gummy bears. That doesn't surprise me. Xylitol, this was a review, 11 RCT studies, 601 mother and baby pairs. They looked at them 6, 9, 12, 18, and 24 months. The mothers that were using habitual xylitol consumption significantly reduced the transmission of salivary mutant streptococci to their children. And this is one study that goes on top of just a multitude of studies that we've got in terms of transmission from mother to child, and the xylitol helps in doing that. And then this was a paper that followed up. Originally this was the sugar and Bader study, the exact study, the xylitol adult caries trial, where they took 691, I think, adults for a period of 33 months, gave them 5 xylitol mints a day, and discovered that there was no outcome based on 5 xylitol mints a day. However, when they went back and did secondary analysis of that data, what they found was that the patients that had class 5 lesions, root surface lesions, those 5 xylitol mints a day reduced the decay rate in incidence in those in those patients in the study by 40%. So 5 xylitol mints a day seemed to target whether it was by increased salivary flow or whatever it was, it reduced the lesions on people that had class 5 decay. So then they went back and said, well, let's look and see if there are other, did it have a greater impact? Maybe it had an outcome on smooth surfaces or interproximal surfaces or occlusal fissures, and basically had no effect on any of those other 3 sites. So, this paper came out and said, again, no significant or consistent effect on distribution by tooth surface type, with the exception of the root surface lesions. So it had no additional effect on the other teeth, and that was with 5 xylitol mints a day, which, quite frankly, I was surprised it had any effect for any of the patients. I just wouldn't expect, 5 xylitol mints to have a greater impact to overcome all the host of different caries risks that patients, are in a study with. This was a random controlled trial. They took 35 children. They gave them xylitol. 38 had sorbitol. Over a 5-week span of time, they used checkerboarding of the entire biome there. It's the home at the Forsyth Institute. And the short-term consumption of xylitol had no impact on the overall composition of the microbiota in the mouth, but resulted in a decrease. But it did result in a decrease in the mutant streptococci. And again, that's consistent with a lot of studies that we've seen in the past over that as well. So that was using xylitol gum in adolescents. So leaving the xylitol and now turning toward nanoparticles of hydroxyapatite, there were a number of studies. There's been 5 studies done in the last 2 years, and 3 of them this year alone, and so I included those, that compared just nanoparticles hydroxyapatite heads up with sodium fluoride. Like if we know that the body uses nanoparticles hydroxyapatite, that's how we remineralize our teeth, that's how nature does it. Well, how does that, if we use just nanoparticles hydroxyapatite in a study, how does that compare to sodium fluoride, which we also know aids in the remineralization of teeth? So in this study, this was published in the Journal of Dental Research in April. It was 2 days. They took teeth. It was an in vitro study. They looked at mutant streptococci. They pH cycled these for 5 minutes twice a day. And what they found was that the application of sodium fluoride resulted in remineralization, but in the presence of a biofilm, the sodium fluoride actually resulted in net demineralization. By contrast, the nanoparticles hydroxyapatite reduced further demineralization compared to water, and the presence of the biofilm actually enhanced this effect. So the biofilm actually enhanced the effect of the nanoparticle hydroxyapatite and actually reduced the effect of sodium fluoride. So, the outcome of this was that the conclusion here is that nanohydroxyapatite is superior to fluoride when just compared head-to-head. In a second study, they did the same thing. They looked at they created some artificial lesions. They looked at surface microhydrants before and then after. They also did SEM analysis and looked at them at 3, 6, 9, and 12 days. They did pH cycling. And it was concluded in this study that the nanohydroxyapatite and fluoride had the potential to individually remineralize initial enamel lesions. They also looked at CPP, ACP in the study and concluded it can be used as an adjunct to fluoride, but it can't be used as an alternative. So while it maybe supported remineralization, it didn't remineralize on its own, at least not in the study. So, but in this study, the nanoparticle HA was equivalent to the fluoride in terms of outcome. Yet one more study comparing the two heads up, and here they looked at 4 different regimens. One was nanohydroxyapatite, ordinary fluoride toothpaste, and some of those with sodium fluoride in them, and then some other paste that had arginine and calcium carbonate, and then also a potassium nitrate and fluoride toothpaste. And what they found was that there are indications that the hydroxyapatite and the fluoride toothpaste may decrease the erosive lesions after treatment, so that they're actually remineralizing the teeth, while the arginine and the other toothpaste that they studied may prevent further progression but didn't really add any remineralization. And in this study, it was, again, an in vitro study involving 50 bovine teeth. So again, in this study, just head-up, straight-up comparison, nanohydroxyapatite was equivalent to fluoride in terms of remineralization. So I thought that, it's very interesting to consider that, well, that's how nature worked it out. and now we're finding evidence that that's equivalent to what we're using fluoride with. So certainly makes an argument for maybe nanoparticles hydroxyapatite, or could be a standalone therapeutic approach. This was a study then that was done on 10% CPP, ACP. It was done on school children, 2.5 to 3.5-year-olds. They all had ICDOS 1 to 3 lesions. It was all done by QLF, and they looked at them at 0, 6, and 12 months and found that the daily application at school of a 10% CPP, ACP paste had no additional improvement or remineralization on the primary upper anterior teeth when compared to over just standard fluoridated toothpaste alone. So that's I certainly raised a question mark in my mind there. And then turning to sugar, which is a hot topic. Oops, let me back up here just a second. So this was, they looked at 100 6 to 12-year-olds. They looked at their diet for 7 days, and then they compared it to their DMFT scores. And what they found was that, no surprise here, increased intake of simple sugar increases the risk of developing cavities. And I've got about 3 or 4 more studies that pretty much all say the same thing, although I think that it's important for us to look at. This was a study of 1,062 7-month-olds. They did recalls on them at 3, 6, 9, 12, and 16 years. So they followed them, and they looked at the salivary counts of mutant streptococci and lactobacillus, and found that basically high sugar intake, that is, their daily intake of their energy was greater than 10% of their diet at 3 years, was associated with highest, mutant streptococci counts and a higher risk for dental caries. The World Health Organization right at the moment says it should be less than 5%, and our target goal should be less than 3%. And so the average American consumes 23 teaspoons of sugar per day, and we should consume about a half a teaspoon is the recommendation. That should be our target goal. How we're going to accomplish that in the Western diet, I have no idea, but that's where we need to head based on our scientific evidence. And if we look at, one more study, 63 1 to 4-year-olds, they looked at them at baseline, looked at them a year later. Solid sugars, sucrose, visible dental plaque, high levels of cariogenic microorganisms, increased dental caries development, particularly explaining the early caries or childhood caries, pattern. Again, so we know sugar is bad. One of the challenges we've got certainly is sugar-sweetened beverages, and in this study, looking at 106 to 15-year-olds, and basically, I just read this, and it's like adolescents, and that's like 13 to 28-year-old age bracket, consume something like 160 gallons of regular soda per year. So not only is that contributing to some of the reflux issues that we see, but it's a catastrophe when it comes to dental caries. So we know that, in this study, high levels of medications, particularly asthma medications, antihistamines, things that dry out the mouth in this age group, which is the number 2 health condition for, people of this age group, certainly increases their DMFT scores. And again, that should be no surprise to any of us. This was a study that I thought was very, very telling. Again, frequent intake of sugar-sweetened beverages is bad for the child, increases their caries risk, and they looked at them, basically 1,274 children at age of 10 to 12 months, and then again at an exam again at 6 years of age. And that's a really bad window. Their primary teeth are starting to erupt, and that's when you're seeing a lot of parents start to introduce soda and sugar-sweetened beverages into the diet of these kids, and that's a really bad window. So that's just for your information. It's another, I think, weapon in your arsenal, as you're educating your patients, your parents primarily on nutrition. This was a study of 790 0 to 5-year-old African-American children and low-income children, and basically their sugar intake and their soda intake was directly related to the non-cavitated caries lesions. Those would be the ICDOS, 0 to 4 lesions in their mouth. So caries and soda are strongly related. Now, we're getting to the topic that I want to introduce to you tonight, because if we talk about dental caries, if we talk about GERD for silent reflux, if we talk about xerostomia or medication-induced hyposalivation, we look at all of these issues. Extrinsic acid that is eroding teeth. If we go through this and look at that, the thing that all of these different conditions that we're dealing with that cause damage and destruction to the teeth, the one thing they all have in common is that they're prolonged periods of low pH. And if it's mediated by bacteria, we're talking about a dental caries process. If it's created by the saliva, we're talking about xerostomia, or it could be medication-induced. If it's an extrinsic acid, it could be an environmental issue, work-related, etc., or it could be part of their diet that's causing a problem. Or if it's intrinsic acid, it could be GERD or silent reflux. It could be associated with airway issues and sleep apnea. So all of these things are interrelated, and it's kind of, I've been talking to a number of people, and we kind of like the light's been going on here. We're really talking about, I've been focused just on dental caries, but really what we're talking about here is the pH balance is very important in the mouth to maintain homeostasis and health. And we're really talking about a syndrome of acid mouth, and now we're just trying to figure out where the acid is coming from and how does it damage the teeth. So we look at dental caries, Philip Marsh, did the early research back in the 1980s that, demonstrated that it's the pH that selects for the bacteria that cause dental caries, dropping the pH, having those cariogenic organisms increases. And we might also be able to reverse that process by increasing the pH, and that's what he did in this study. And so the upper panel here, the dark-colored bacteria are the acidogenic aciduric bacteria, and just by trying to raise the pH of the biofilm, the healthy organisms start to take it back over. And so rather than, maybe necessarily wiping out all the bacteria, maybe pH is a strategy in terms of reducing caries risk. And that's been our strategy at Carie Free for 15 years. And that's why they all have high pHs in our products. We try and mimic nature in terms of that. And this was a paper that was published in the Caries Research Journal. And we know when you have this prolonged cariogenic environment in the mouth, it changes the bacteria. It changes the profile of the bacteria. There's fewer numbers of bacteria in terms of species because fewer bacteria can adapt to survive in this environment, and we know that it changes, which bacteria are present. So there's an altered bacterial profile. And when we look at those profiles specifically, the Vianello bacteria disappear. And the Vianello bacteria in the biofilm play the role of metabolizing these small organic acids like lactic acid, acetic acid, and they turn it into urea and ammonium, which raises the pH in the mouth. So even as we're starting to eat and digest this, we have bacteria in the biofilm that are already helping us. Our saliva's, our saliva's helping us raise the pH, but we also have the biofilm is actually helping us maintain homeostasis. So we saw a decrease in the ability to do that, and at the same time we saw an increase in Solobacterium. Now this is important, Streptococcus parasanguinus, which is kind of a normal inhabitant in the mouth, but it's a strongly acid uric bacteria as well. Just remember that bacteria here for just a few minutes while we go through this. And this is a review that talked about, again, that could be a strategy, but there really aren't very many products on the market that have pH buffering ingredients, contain calcium and phosphate and pH buffering. And certainly we know the Carie Free products, we designed them that way, and there are a couple other products that are starting to follow that as well. So pH buffering is certainly a strategy. This is a study that was published. I saw Terry Donovan. I was at the Academy of the Canadian Academy of Restorative Dentistry and Prosthodontics last month in Toronto. Terry and I were both on the podium together, and Terry just published this in July in the Journal of Prosthodontics. And they looked at xerostomic or saliva substitute products and looked at the pH of these products and their erosive potential. And he said to me, pulled me aside, Kim, you're going to love this study because the CTX2 spray, has a pH of 9.1 in their study. We claim that it has a pH at least of 9.0, and the outcome was 0. It had no demineralization, no mineral tooth loss. And if you look at Oasis or the Biotine moisturizing spray that had anything that had a pH pretty much above
say 6.7 or 6.6. Tap water 6.99, rain at 7.1 didn't cause any demineralization, but the rest of those, obviously cause the potential for demineralization and erosion potential. So they're using a product to maybe try and alleviate this issue and actually maybe causing demineralization in the process. So the carie-free product, in my mind, came out very well in that study. But when we look at acidic beverages, this was a study that I thought was very interesting. It points out the difference between, just because they all have a pH of 3.0, some of them require a lot more neutralization because they have a higher titratable acidity in the beverage than they do, than other beverages do. And that's kind of a chemical concept here, but go with me on this one. Orange juice is worse than Coca-Cola at the same pH. It has a higher titratable acidity, so it takes a lot more neutralization for the orange juice to neutralize that impact. So the orange juice was worse than Coca-Cola, which is worse than sugar combined with water at a neutral pH. So Dr. Michael Hughes, I met a year ago in Barcelona at a meeting that I was speaking at. Doug Young and Graham Milicic and I were there speaking at an academy, a European academy, and Dr. Hughes practices in Florida. He has a primarily, the community is in more of a retirement community, so a lot of his patients are older. And he contacted me about 2 months ago and said, Kim, I've made an observation, and science begins an observation. And my observation is this: the patients that I see that have these NCCLs, these non-carious cervical lesions, I'm starting to ask them about reflux, and guess what? Literally almost 100% of them have reflux or silent reflux. And when I measured their ATP score, they didn't have any dental caries, but they had high ATP scores. And he said, how can you explain that? And I said, well, basically, Michael, if they have prolonged periods of low pH, they have acid uric bacteria, which we know produce a tremendous amount of ATP. And so, believe it or not, Michael turned me on to this book. I then contacted Mike Nelson in California, who is, I think in my mind, one of the leading experts on sleep dentistry in the country. And we brought Mike into this conversation as well. And we started to talk about, it's not just dental caries, it's just not reflux, it's not sleep medicine, it's not just the saliva or xerostomia or medications, but we're really talking about acid in the mouth and all the different things that contributes to. And Michael turned me on to this book, The Chronic Cough Enigma. Dr. Jamie Kaufman is an otolaryngologist. She's probably our country's leading expert on GERD and silent reflux. I would recommend you read this book. I had 3 patients today that I was doing NCCLs on. I've talked like this till I feel like a broken record. I've been blaming it all on the abrasivity of the toothpaste, and I'll show you a study in a second, but all 3 of these patients today, and I'm noticing the same trend that Dr. Hughes is noticing, they all had NCCLs, they didn't have decay, but they also had high ATP scores. And I had 2 patients last week who are both hygienists that had the same experience. So a lot of the research and the common thought process is, a lot of people, and there's evidence, I wrote a blog on this, there's evidence that this is from occlusal load and malocclusion. There's also abundant evidence most recently that this is due to the abrasivity of toothpaste. The abrasivity of toothpaste today are ridiculously off the charts, in my opinion. When you look at their relative abrasive indexes, I'm not sure where companies are going with this, but they're very high compared to where we've been in the past. And in this study, certainly you add toothpaste to the equation and you end up with these NCCLs. Now, where we're coming from at the moment, and Michael proposed this idea, is that it's actually the GERD is probably pre-softening those root surfaces. Then the patients are brushing it all night long, and then they brush in the morning with an abrasive or a whitening toothpaste that has an RDA of either 200 or 250, and that's what's creating a lot of the wear, the erosive wear on these teeth. I mean, 100% agreement with him, and we're going to, a group of us are going to write a paper on this, but I think that it's really, if we look at the big picture, it's really about acid mouth, whether it's, you go through the whole process, because I'm treating several patients this year that have environmental acid that's creating severe wear on their teeth. And this is a paper just published this month in the Compendium Journal. It was on medication-induced. This is a photo right out of the paper. erosion of the teeth as well. And so it's from a lack of saliva, and the saliva is a neutralizing agent there. Now, I talked to you just a second ago about Streptococcus parasanguinus. This paper is from 2000, but I went back to do some research on, well, what oral bacteria are strongly acid uric but not necessarily cariogenic? And believe it or not, we've already identified those bacteria. The patients that had prolonged periods of low pH in the mouth but without dental caries have an abundance of Streptococcus oralis, parasanguinus, and intermedius. So we already know what these bacteria probably are that are inhabiting some of these patients' mouth as well, because it's going to alter their bacterial profile too. So at the end of the day, it's all about balance. You have a healthy balance in pH in your mouth, you're going to have, greater episodes of remineralization versus demineralization. You're going to have a healthy Stefan curve. The patient's going to be in equilibrium and they're going to be healthy. That gets out of whack, and the acid in the mouth, whether it's intrinsic, extrinsic, whether it's caused by medication, whether it's caused by, acidogenic aciduric bacteria, which contribute to dental caries, whatever that is, it's all part of the same condition. And certainly these strategies may not only be useful for treating dental caries, but the same products that are helpful for dental caries may also be very helpful for dry mouth or helpful for patients that have GERD or silent reflux. So I just wanted to introduce that topic to you tonight. We're planning on writing a paper on it, and I think you're going to see a lot more information on that probably in 2016. So I got through all of this just about on time. Lacey, I moved rather rapidly through a lot of studies, but I hope that you found that most of these studies tonight will reinforce what you already knew. Some of it may have been kind of new information and new thoughts, but I hope that you found this helpful for you. So Lacey, we have time to take a couple of questions, I think.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Cooch. Yeah, we've had a lot of questions come in, so we have time to answer just a few of those right now. So first, we use the carie-free CRA form. With the new finding in genetics, how can we incorporate them into our process of risk identification?
That's a great question, and I wish I had the perfect answer for you on that. The challenge that we've got is I can cite one Feingold and Schaefer study from 2013 where they found actually a geographic distribution of the lesions within the mouth that were associated with a particular gene, like we talked about the lysyl-2 or the AGAP1 gene in the past. But short of being able to identify a geographic presentation of lesions in the mouth, we really don't have the information to be able to really diagnose that. And so the patients that I've kind of put into that, I guess, category is when I've got a patient that's high caries risk, obviously because they have lesions, and I go through the usual suspects, the bacteria, the diet, and saliva, and I don't come up with much. I start talking to the patient that this may be a genetic predisposition that they've got, and the best thing that we can do is just try to minimize their acid exposure, those acid moments in the mouth, and help them understand what contributes to those and how they can help protect themselves. I can't change their DNA. I can't be specific yet, although you certainly can talk about, and when it comes to diet, if you've got a child that's a super taster, they're going to be very averse to certain of the green vegetables, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cauliflower. They're going to be, literally they're so sensitive to phenols at that age with that gene that they may actually vomit if you try and feed them that. So there's something, and that child may then also have, if they have the TES 1R2 or 1R3 gene or the GLU2 gene, they're going to have a real sweet tooth. So the child that has a sweet tooth, that's probably a genetic preference, a deep predisposition for them. So again, you can talk to the parents about it and help educate them, but the best thing we can do for those patients, so we don't come up with anything else, they're still high caries risk, there's probably some genetics playing a role there. It's just to help them understand what they can do to best minimize acid exposure in the mouth or acidic episodes and just try and remain as healthy as possible. Great question, Lacey. At some point in time, I believe we'll probably be using a swab in the mouth and being able to do a genetic assay and say you have this gene or that gene or this predisposition. Again, maybe not being able to modify their DNA, but being able to at least be a little more informative about, what specifically is contributing to their caries risk. So that's a great question, Pam, and I'm happy that they're using a risk assessment form.
Okay, here's another one. What is the reason some colleagues are switching from chlorhexidine to other antimicrobial agents?
Probably the same reason that maybe the same reason I switched 13 years ago. It's just I just wasn't finding a very significant outcome with it. I wasn't getting the outcome that I was looking for. Certainly the ADA, Council of Scientific Affairs, says don't use it. The Cochrane reports haven't found it to be significant in terms of reducing caries outcomes. So, of course, John Featherstone and his group, they continue to get some outcomes with it. So, I wouldn't say it's exactly black and white. John and I maybe agree to disagree on this topic, but maybe it's they stop based on the science, and maybe they stop based on just the personal experience with it. My experience was that it didn't really affect the lactobacillus, and it seemed to actually increase the levels of lactobacillus that the patients had, and that was a concern to me, and so that's why I stopped using it. So, unfortunately, I then went to povidone iodine, which is very problematic, and then, of course, I ended up with sodium hypochlorite. So, that's probably the best answer I can give you for that.
Okay. So I had another question in mind originally,
Okay.
but this one just came in and it's really good. What is the relevance of diagnodent or other imaging to the diagnosis of carious lesions in occlusal fissures?
That's a great question, and that is a very loaded topic, and that could be the entire topic for a webinar. Thank you for asking that. I know I mentioned the QLF tonight and the diagnodent. I have a diagnodent. I use it. For me, the greatest use of the diagnodent is as an educational or motivational tool for the patient, because let me give you this scenario. I'm sitting with a patient, and I'm looking at a mandibular second premolar, and I get a diagnodent reading of 28. Am I going to do nothing on that fissure? Am I going to put a sealant in the fissure? Am I going to do a preventive resin restoration, or am I going to do an occlusal restoration on that fissure? I'm going to open it up. What am I going to do? And, well, visually, radiographically, I don't see any evidence, but I have this reading of 35. You pick a number. Doesn't matter. Now, that by itself doesn't give me enough data to make that decision. But this is why I mentioned this in the presentation tonight, and think about this for a second. If this is an 88-year-old woman, and she's been in my practice for 37 years, and it's non-cavitated, and she's low caries risk, I'm probably going to do nothing. Contrast that with a 12-year-old sitting in my chair who's had 7 cavities in the last year. The family has an infrequent history of recare, and he's got 2 other lesions someplace else. He's high caries risk, he's plaque all over his teeth, and he's got a poor diet, and I get a 28 on that. At the minimum, I'm going to put a sealant in it, and there's probably a good chance I'm going to do a PRR, and then when I open it up, I may find decay under there. And that sets off an alarm to me. So the diagnodent by itself doesn't provide me with enough data, but when you add that to the whole picture, the patient's caries risk, then it clarifies, and so I think it's helpful. I mean, at that point in time, if, in that patient, if the reading was 9, I wouldn't worry about it. And if it was 60, we'd go right in. So I think that it's helpful. It's another piece of information, but it's not an exclusive piece of information. I think you still have to use good visual, radiographic, and then I would argue you still need to add in your knowledge and experience for that patient, and their age and caries risk are, I think, significant factors you need to take into consideration when you're making that decision. And it's challenging. We all are faced with that every day. And so whoever asked the question, again, it's a great question, and I appreciate you asking it. I hope that I gave you some information that you'll find helpful as you practice with it. again, I think it's a great motivational tool. That alarm goes off, and they, for the patient that does have decay, does have a lesion, something I do really want to treat, it just helps affirm in the patient's mind that, yeah, I need to do something about this. So it's a good motivational tool as well. Great question.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Cooch. And again, thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. We still have questions coming in, so look for answers to those in the next few days via email. And if there's part of the webinar you'd like to hear again, we'll also be sending out a recording soon. Please contact us if you'd like to learn more about implementing carie-free into your practice, and have a great evening.
Hey, thank you, Lacey, and thank you, everybody, tonight. I hope that you found this helpful. And I will see you on our next webinar. Good night.